Hello, everyone, and welcome to this A Thinking with PJ O'Rourke. They say you should never meet your heroes. Well, let's see how this hour goes then, because the first book on politics that I read and laughed was a book called Republican Party Reptile, written by PJ O'Rourke. And I'd never read a book about politics or history for that matter that could really make you laugh, and it made me laugh out loud. And in reading, I think, Peter, this is your 19th book, maybe. In reading
20th.
this,
20th.
How much? 20th.
Yes, for my sins.
Too good to check. I read this. A Cry from the Far Middle. I just want to give you a sense of how brilliant this is and how much I loved it. Was that we're not going to discuss the acknowledgements to this book, but even the acknowledgements make you laugh. When you get to the acknowledgements of this book, just to be clear about PJ's writing style, you're on page 3 before anyone has been thanked in any way at all. So there's just the musings on the idea of the acknowledgements, and then rather wonderfully, he thanks his publisher, a man called Morgan. Morgan paid me money. What he got in return was this book. Call it one of the mysteries of late-stage capitalism. I don't understand late-stage capitalism, and thank God, neither does Morgan. And that is the way the book kicks off its acknowledgements. So PJ, I am really, really delighted that you're here with us. We've been angling to get you into what was our physical newsroom and is now our digital newsroom for some time. And of course, by good fortune, it couldn't be a better moment between the election and the inauguration to talk about where the US finds itself. I should just tell you, because you're new to our thinkings, you will know well what it's like to run a chaotic newsroom. As many of you will know, PJ is the editor of American Consequences. The idea of a thinking is that everyone can weigh in. So you'll see people will be giving their points of view in the chat. I'll try and bring them into the conversation. If you want to raise your digital hand, do, and I'll try and bring your point in, your observation into PJ. We sort of have a rule. It's pretty loosely enforced, which is no questions. We want people to put their points of view and to hear people exchange what they think. So can do that. But given it's you, we might enforce it more loosely than usual. PJ, can we start with this? Towards the end of the book, you write the inauguration speech that you wish the next president would give, right? And it's basically a statement about the relative powerlessness of the president of the United States. And I wonder, now that you are just, a couple of months away from that inauguration, whether or not you're having second thoughts. Actually, you're thinking it'd be rather great to have a president who does have some effective power, who can address some of the things that are troubling the United States.
No, please. No, I think we just had one of those who thought he could do everything. As an old English major, I come back to the legends of the Fisher King and so on. There's a whole body of mythology about the sacred king. And in a situation where you have a sacred king, which apparently various ancient societies did, everything good that happened in that society was caused by, brought into existence by this sacred king. But if anything went wrong, if they lost a war, if there was a flood or a drought, if the crops failed, they got lice or whatever, it was all the king's fault. And then they would kill the king, sacrifice the sacred king, and a new sacred king would be installed. A new, I would imagine, rather nervous sacred king, not a job I'd apply for. And we have a tendency in the United States to regard our presidents that way. I mean, poor George H.W. Bush, good case in point, had one of the highest popularity ratings of any president in the history of the United States. And he had just won a small but important war, the Gulf War. He just kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, hadn't invaded Iraq, but it just kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in a very, what I think was quite a worthwhile sort of enterprise, and not generally a sort of pro-war guy. But I thought that one was well done. I was there and covering it and saw it all happen. And then a tiny little recession comes along, a recession so small that we have no name for it, and generally speaking, no memory of it. But right at the end of Bush's term in the early 1990s, just after the Gulf War, there was a itsy bitsy little recession, and they voted right out of office. Sacred king, we don't kill them, of course, in the United States. What we do is we give them an enormous fat book contract for something that nobody will ever read. But they're as good as dead.
So your view is actually having a president who's aware of the limits of their powers is a good thing.
It would be fabulous. Yes, it really would.
You talked to in the book, which also really kind of rang true to me, which was that you weren't as worried about the growth of government, about big government as big politics, that politics seemed to be growing out of control. Can you just talk a bit about that, what you mean by the difference between the growth of politics and the growth of government?
Well, government's what, leaving politics aside, government's what paves our roads, what picks up the trash, guards the coasts and adjudicates the law, enforces contracts and so on. And in a large, prosperous, complicated society, we were bound to have a large, expensive, not prosperous, but large, expensive, complicated government. I'm pretty libertarian, but I don't subscribe to the libertarian idea that you can get away with no government at all, that you should, I don't know what, sort of privatize the army. I covered Lebanon during the Civil War there. I saw privatized armies. It really isn't a good idea. But maybe the Coast Guard, maybe you could, at any rate. Politics is the struggle for who controls this huge apparatus. And it is deeply unpleasant. I mean, not the apparatus, the government itself is, good, bad, indifferent, human. It does some jobs quite well, does other jobs rather poorly, costs too much usually, but on the other hand, sometimes provides good value for money. But the business of attempting to grab control of that government just brings out absolutely the worst in people. And the worst in people, politicians, that would be the worst in people. Take a look at them, is this really the sort of people you would want in your home?
And then Peter, the reason I ask it, I wondered if I like to start by just giving the context for where we are now, because I'm really intrigued to know what you think is the kind of president that we'll get with Joe Biden. If on the one hand you have big politics and more politics than ever, and at the same time a constrained president, and probably a president who respects, or you might think respects, the rule of law and therefore will accept those constraints.
I think it's going to be pretty quiet going, really. We can't tell until the beginning of January who will hold the Senate, but it looks as though we're going to have, to some degree, a divided government, which is generally a good thing. It restrains both sides. So we'll probably have either Republican control in our House of Lords, which is considerably has more weight than yours does, in our upper chamber of our legislature, or we will have near deadlock, so that Biden will have to tread carefully. And Biden's not a terribly original thinker. I mean, he's a kind of a perpetual also ran. His political history. I mean, he's been in the Senate for yonks. He's been in the Senate since I think 1972. He was elected to the Senate, and and then of course he was vice president under Barack Obama. And Biden is the kind of guy you always give the no-hoper problems to. Nuclear armament control. He was in charge of that in the White House. The Eastern European brief, the Belarus brief. Stamping out corruption in Ukraine. As a matter of fact, while with some irony, his own son seems to have been involved in that. But never mind. I'm not casting aspersions on Biden, but that actually was one of his briefs, to stamp out You might as well try and stamp out sand in Saudi Arabia as try and stamp out sand in Ukraine. I've been there. Lovely place in many ways, but when it comes to corruption, they have it figured out. So Biden is that kind of guy, perpetual backbencher, thrust into very important role, which I think that he will execute in a predictable, unexciting, mildly energetic way. He's going to have to make a certain amount of noise about all the sort of change and newness and stuff coming in, but I don't think much will come of it. But on the other hand, he's safe hands. You know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, no Churchill, of course, but no Trump either. Thank God.
And do you think, because you kick off, I've probably read the book more recently than you have.
You probably have. Yeah, true enough.
You kick off the book by saying, Riley, that, you know, it's possible that this kind of period of division in the United States is going to be followed by a period of reconciliation, but possibly just as likely, after a period of reflection, human nature will play out and people will return to their arguments with even more vigor and passion. And I sort of say, you know, that you're betting on human nature and not in a good way. Is that your read on what happens next in the United States?
Oh, yes. Yeah. America has to be understood as an exceedingly divided country. I mean, I think the best way for a British audience to understand the United States is imagine if the north of Ireland had, what is it now, 320 million. Imagine there are 320 million people in Northern Ireland, and that Northern Ireland were the size of Australia, and that instead of just Catholics and Protestants, there were 18 or 19 or 20 different warring groups who loathed and detested each other. Imagine what that would be like for those of us who, you know, remember the Troubles in Belfast. The amazing thing about America is that it never degenerated into the level of violence and hatred, and that maybe simply having two sides is too few.
There is that argument, isn't there? Do you buy that idea that America polarizes because you've got to vote red or blue, you've got to, and the whole edifice of politics, or the whole system of politics, you know, polarizes because it's one thing or the other?
Oh, right. Yeah, absolutely. And the reason for that, I mean, it's both a blessing and a curse. America doesn't actually have political parties as political parties are understood on your side of the Atlantic. There's no card you carry in your wallet. And as you may have noticed from various political candidates from both of our political parties, it is obviously impossible to be expelled from our political parties. There is no membership. I mean, if you donate so much as a nickel to either a Democrat or a Republican, you become a member of that party, will you, nil you, and they pester you for the rest of your life. What we have instead of parties is we have two broad tendencies. Maybe best understood as going back to the time of the sort of Whigs and Tories in say the early 19th century or the late 18th century. And you know, one of these general tendencies is to say that government should fix the problem, whatever the problem may be. Government should fix it. And the other tendency is to think the government is the problem. And should get out of the way and let people, you know, conduct their lives as they. Now, these are two ideas that are not mutually exclusive. We've all had both of these thoughts. It is possible to contain both these ideas in your mind at the same time without cognitive dissonance, without becoming neurotic. Everyone who has dealt, well, the American example we usually give is the Department of Motor Vehicles, but yours would probably be something like the National Health. You can simultaneously be extremely fond of national health and think of it as a great benefit, and be very glad that it's there. And at the same time, when you've been waiting for 3 hours, to see a doctor about this, that, or the other thing, and you've had to fill out reams of bump while you were waiting, you can simultaneously think the government is the problem. At the same time, you're thinking the government should fix the problem, or has fixed the problem, or is trying to fix the problem. So we have these two broad tendencies, which generally have quite a bit of overlap. But when it comes time to elect someone to office, we have to line up on one side or the other, even though we may be in the middle about a lot of these issues. So the result is a fierce partisan struggle, often between people who don't really disagree with each other very much.
And my the chairman of Tortoise, one of the founders, actually the former US ambassador here, is a guy called Matthew Barsden. And Matthew and I argue sometimes because he says the way in which the United States gets portrayed is way more divided, way more polarized than it is. It's a much more purple country than the red blue map on election night would have you believe. The sort of central tenet of the book here is it's dispatches from a divided land. Do you think that's right, PJ? Actually, yes, on the politics it may be divided, but in the real world, in everyday life, it's a much more together place than the politics.
As anyone who has visited or spent any time here knows, America is an exceedingly American place. And the one, uniting factor is how American every American is, no matter where they come from or how recently they arrived, or what their financial or educational circumstances are. You can spot them. It's just, when you're traveling through Europe, you can spot an American from thousands of yards away. I mean, there's just something so American, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. We are a deeply divided country. We always have been a deeply divided country. After all, America is not someplace that's united by a cultural heritage. We're not united by bloodlines or ethnicity. We're barely united by language. As a person who lives in New England, but who has a daughter who went to college in New Orleans, can tell you there are people in New Orleans that I simply cannot comprehend a word they say. Worse than Scots, where I always go wrong in trying to understand what they say. But
just to let you know, PJ, we've got the wonderful thing about the function of this is that I can see lots of people's faces at the same time. Some English people laughing, and also I'm looking at some Scots who are not.
You're not laughing. Well, no, nothing bad on you. I actually like haggis, and I don't mind a good bagpipe, but I can't understand what you're saying sometimes. We'll
test that in a moment.
Okay, we'll get a Scots on to ask, to make a statement, ask a question.
But PJ, can you just? Because the reason I do want to just get at this is that I think there's a tendency that we have, journalists have, which is to say it's always more than it's ever been, right? And in the after, this was the biggest, the most consequential election in the history of the United States. Now we're headed to a more polarized and more divided United States than has ever existed. And so, what do you say in context terms to that? Do you think?
I say, I'm 73 years old. Not only was I there for the 1960s, I, in my own little personal way, did what I could to cause the 1960s. If you think America's divided now, go back, 50 some years. The screaming and yelling around the dinner table, the rioting in the streets, the rioting in the cities, all much more severe than it was now. And forget the 1960s. What about the 1860s when we were having a civil war? Now that's polarized, and however bad things have been lately, and they haven't been great, But Fort Sumter is not taking any incoming from Confederate artillery at the moment, you know. So I mean, you know, let's keep a sense of proportion here, you know.
And just, Peter, interestingly, I'm going to bring in Michelle Gardner, if I might, because Michelle's written and said that she's a Brit expat in LA observing politics versus people versus politicians, which is a kind of interesting combination. Michelle, do you want to weigh in at this stage on what the divisions look like to you?
Yeah, thanks, James. Hi, PJ. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's totally exhausting. And the last couple of years living here, it totally has been. Both through Tortoise, and I did a little Harvard EX course, and I started to try and want, especially since the George Floyd protests, try to understand more, because I think you made a really good point there, PJ, about, you know, that Americans are American. And I think from afar, we have a sort of slightly rose-tinted, aren't you wonderful teenagers, you'll get it right, we've all been through it. But when you're here, I think I've put earlier as well, individualism is the only thing that seems to, and I'm being very general, bring people together. And spending time reading, spending time trying to listen, trying to understand what I was going through in Los Angeles, especially over the last 8 months, and today's the start of our new safer at home order again. One thing I noted, that if you read on the policies, that some of them aren't that far apart. The politicians, as you commented so rightly, are so individual and not politicians that we're used to coming together under a party banner and in certain cases for the good of the people. And they did chuck that idiot out in Iowa, the supremacist, thank God. And then there is the people, and I don't have this answer, and others will have a much smarter view, but they are trying to take to the streets. They are physically doing that. They are making their voices heard when you're flipping the likes of Georgia, Arizona. You know, I know Georgia itself took 10 years. But yeah, when you step back from it, as I think everyone's commenting on, the individualism is what pulls everybody away in the end, because they all just want what's right for them. I hate to use this term. That's why I try individual, but very selfish.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, you know, I mean, one could look at it as selfish. I mean, I think you're spot on. Individualism is the thing that unites America. What unites us is what divides us. But, you know, sometimes it's selfish. Sometimes it's enlightened self-interest. Sometimes it's simply freedom at work. We suffer from a problem of having, in politics as in many things, we have very little quality control in America. But on the other hand, we have like a sort of a kind of unlimited range. I was friends with Christopher Hitchens, and you know, Christopher became an American, and he became an American basically not because he was in favor of American policies, he usually wasn't, or because he was in favor of American culture, he considered it non-existent. He became an American citizen just because of the latitude of the country, just the number of things that were possible here, the things that you could do. And you know, it's fun. It's fun. It can be dangerous fun. It can be annoying fun. It can be, you know, strange. Now, Michelle, there's something I want to ask you. Actually, have you read since you got to LA, Evelyn Waugh's *The Loved One*?
No.
Okay, *The Loved One*, wonderful, wonderful novel. But *The Loved One* begins with a description of expatriate Brits in what is obviously an extremely primitive colonial outpost somewhere in the tropics. And you're on to about page 4 before you realize he's describing Hollywood.
Oh, yeah. I must admit, we chose to live in Altadena in the mountains, but
there
yes,
you go.
It is. LA is very different from anywhere
place. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, can I just, Michelle, I'm going to pick up the Loved One too, but Peter, I'm going to bring in Mehdi Ascari in a second, but can I just ask you, you know, I love your point. A colleague of mine, old colleague of mine at the time, said that the best columnists say the things that are really obvious and that no one has the courage to say. So yes, Americans are very American, we Brits find ourselves to be increasingly British, right? And I don't necessarily say that in an entirely good way. And funnily enough, I think more than ever, in the light of the politics we've seen in the last few years, but certainly amongst ourselves, we've talked a lot about the American system, checks and balances, written constitutions. And I know there's a sort of academic, sometimes even condescending interest by Brits into US politics. But actually, when you look now at our system of politics, do you think it's quaint and rather primitive?
No, 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 not at all. But the thing is that you've got, when did you last cut off the head of a king? You have, since Cromwell, built up a series of like traditions and norms and a sort of unspoken, structure that it really works. I mean, your politics have been very good. I mean, we're talking by world historical standards here. I'm not saying they've been good specifically, but compared to, say Germany between the world wars, I mean, actually, Britain works. Stepping aside for just 1 second to that point of, I've been going to Britain, or as it then was England, since 1970. I've spent a fair amount of time there. And it's truly, Britain has become much more British, much more sort of cosmopolitan, much less regional, a more homogeneous country than it was, 50 years ago. But anyway, back to the point about political institutions. We had to start from scratch. We had your norms and your customs, but once we had the revolution, we didn't have your king, and we didn't know quite how to replace the king. And it's important to remember that George III was politically far more powerful than Elizabeth II, for instance. He still had a major say, if not a definitive say, in all foreign policy, and a great deal of say in domestic policy. Your vote was limited by property qualifications. The country was filled with rotten boroughs where one or two great lords could determine who was the parliamentary representative, while your big industrial, or what would become your big industrial cities, were practically unrepresented. So we were faced with having to start over again. And so we took a number of things from your system, but we decided that more checks and balances were probably needed, not necessarily in your country because you had ancient custom to rely on, but we didn't. And so, it was a great thing. It was a great thing that the people who designed the American political system were people of the 18th century Enlightenment and not people of 19th century Romanticism. And they did a remarkably sort of practical, clear-cut, straightforward job, which we've spent past 200 and some years attempting to screw up, but we've never succeeded in screwing up the very good job that those founding fathers did.
It's really interesting. As you were talking, PJ, I saw that Lucy Huberman wrote, I think Tortoise and I am too romantic about the US, and that PJ is too romantic about the UK, which is probably almost maybe that's temperament, but it's also things look more attractive from a distance. I'm gonna bring in Mehdi Asghari, who's got his hand up, but also I saw that there was an interesting point about gonzo journalism from Julian Bora, which I'd bring in, and Stacey Lipton Davis can come in. I'd like to turn Stacey to. Mehdi, why don't you go first?
Thanks, James. Hi, PJ. You may not be fully aware that in this forum, we are not permitted, or perhaps we are not encouraged to ask a direct question. But I'm going to seek everyone's pardon and do ask you a direct question. And in that, has Trump in the last 4 years, what he's done, damaged the fabric, the the political fabric structure of the US that is not going to take a short time to put back together. When one hears about just under 80% of people who voted for it, they believe that the election was fraud. And everything else is done. Is that going to be put back? I don't know, taking a decade or perhaps more to put things back as they were in 2016.
I'm not too worried about that, really. I think now 8 years of Trump might have done some very serious damage. I think that 4 years of Trump was like having a very bad tenant in your rental house who really left the place a mess, who is not getting his rent deposit back. You know, you're really going to have the cleaners come in and the painters, you know, and there's going to need a lot of hoovering and dusting and so on is going to have to be done. And some of the silver has doubtless been stolen. But I don't think he's done irreparable damage. If anything, actually, I think that the America's little adventure in having a complete clown for a president was a sort of you know, had a healthy effect on people. You know, all of a sudden, people sort of liked the way things were. I think better than they used to. Christopher Buckley wrote a the only funny satire of the Trump administration that's been accomplished so far, called "Make Russia Great Again." And in Chris's dedication, he says, "This is dedicated to the deep state. Thank you for your service." So, no, I think you know, the tenant did leave a real mess, but he didn't burn the house down. He didn't kill the cat, and I think we'll recover. As for the 80% of the Trump voters, well, let's see that, you know, let's try and parse that out by what percentage of the population it is. Only about half of Americans vote, so we're down to 40% there. And then half of them voted the other way, so we're down to 20%. And like 20% of Americans believe that space aliens caused COVID-19. So, you know, we're not any nuttier than we ever were.
And PJ, just an extension of that, what's Trump's lasting impact on the Republican Party?
Well, that's going to be a disaster. But then because of what I was talking about earlier, the fact that we don't have real political parties that you actually belong to and that have a creed that you have to adhere to and that you can get expelled from and so on, our parties tend to get damaged less by bad actors. You know, during the so-called Reagan Revolution, during Reagan's presidency, people were writing the obituary of the Democratic Party. During Watergate, when Nixon, you know, everybody was writing the obituary of the Republican Party. It's hard to imagine, so bad as Trump has been, I don't think he did the kind of damage to the Republican Party that Nixon did. We tend to recover from these things. You know, we've had bad presidents of both stripes, and you know, we bounce back into the odd amorphous duality that is American politics.
Well, I'm gonna ask Stacey to weigh in, because Stacey, I think, was saying that she's from Canada and worried about the extent to which sort of US politics exports in Canadian politics. I think I'd say as a Brit, we also think that a fair bit of US politics ends up sooner or later in ours. Stacey.
Well, as I was saying in my comment, that every time the president coughs, we get a cold, and that is a sure thing. Whoops, sorry about that. What many of us up here in Canada are worried about is the inaction that you were referring to when you were referring to Biden, and the fact that he's really a backbencher by nature, and he isn't terribly effective. So we have a lot of issues that we're concerned about, and what's going to happen in the solutions department when it comes to Biden. And of course, I mentioned the issue of, you have 350 million people down there. Why is there such a void in leadership? And it's a big concern to us. We don't have a great leader. We have somebody with great hair, but we don't have somebody who's a great leader. But at least he's not so damaging that we are in a total mess. And so my concern is what's going to happen to the big mess if you have such avoidant leadership.
Well, the avoidant leadership is a really interesting question. I mean, I think it speaks well to the opportunities available in America, the mercantile investment opportunities, the professional opportunities, the artistic and creative opportunities that none of the people in their right mind in the United States tend to go into politics. You know, and that speaks well of our nation, but of course it doesn't work very well for our political system. You know, we don't have an old-fashioned upper class, or we do, but they're like sort of broke and hiding out in remote New England. We don't have an old-fashioned upper class with a tradition of public service. I mean, I'm glad we don't have that kind of class division in the United States. On the other hand, it is the kind of class division that produced Churchill. So there are times when it is lacking. And I always felt great sympathy. I grew up on the Canadian border, on the Great Lakes, you know, very, very close to Canada. We got Canadian television, we got Canadian radio. We went to Canada a lot. And I still go to Canada a couple of times a year, spend some time up there. And it must be extremely annoying to be in a country that is so similar in certain ways from the United States, but has its like very distinct differences, very own distinct culture, especially the Francophone side of it. And to have your entire population, I mean, I think something like 80% of Canadians live within 50 miles of the United States, and you're only about 10% of our population. So indeed, our sneeze becomes your flu so easily, and it must just be exceedingly annoying. And I feel full sympathy for Canadians.
Vijay, thank you. And Stacey, thank you too. I should say we don't have a prime minister with great hair, but we have a prime minister with ambiguously interesting hair, because I don't know whether you know, PJ, he told an interviewer that he dyes his hair. And then when this was published, he then issued a statement to say that he was joking, but never clarified whether it was true or not. So we're left with, amongst many other mysteries, at the heart of government, Boris Johnson's hair. I'm going to, on that sort of...
Actually, let me break in on that for a moment, because I'm friends with Rachel, Boris's sister. And
what does she say?
Hair is, it's the hair is his.
The hair is his.
Deny or deny.
But sorry, Peter, you think that Rachel thinks he doesn't dye it?
Well, I've never out and asked her, but I will later today, as a matter of fact. but I'm knowing Rachel, it's one of those things that would come up if he had.
So it is like one of the big, you know, talking points of the UK. Well, it's not. It's a tiny talking point of the UK. Like, not a talking point. I'm marginally intrigued by it, so it's a muttering point, one that I mutter to myself. Listen, we should probably get away from this dead end. I was going to go, if I might, to... There are a couple of points about journalism that people are making, PJ. Julian Borer made a point about gonzo journalism and gonzo politics. And Julian, are you there? Do you want to put it to PJ?
Yes. Am I on?
You are on.
I'm on. PJ, first of all, I just want to very quickly say, get the gush out of the way. Much as James pointed out earlier on, Republican Party reptile. I have a crap memory. I can't remember the detail of it, but to pimp Maya Angelou, I remember how you made me feel. Leave that at that.
It's about all my memory does for me anymore. I can't remember your phone number, but I can remember the way your phone number made me feel.
Yeah, exactly. Both times. It was just something I'm intrigued about is, and it was actually a piece that I put up that was just Thompson. The reason why I wonder about Trump being almost the perfect gonzo politician is back to that piece that Thompson said about, but what was the story nobody had bothered to say, so we would have to drum it up on our own. Free enterprise, the American dream. And I just have this feeling that that original, subjective, irreverent gonzo spirit, when you take that through time, reams and reams and reams of beautifully formed satire, in the end, weren't we going to end up at never really ever knowing what a truth was? And I just wonder whether fake news is the bastard child of gonzo.
Yes, you put your finger on something that I feel a little guilty about myself, which is not so much my own reporting. I try and keep, I mean, my opinions are obviously insane, but I try to keep my facts straight. But as somebody who has worked at for nearly 10 years and ended up editing the National Lampoon, yes, I mean, satire, when irony is your entire worldview and you have a satirical attitude toward everything, it does have its bad side effects. To gonzo journalism itself, I really felt that there's only been one real practitioner of gonzo journalism, that it began and ended, was born and died with Hunter Thompson. And Hunter Thompson has to be regarded, I mean, his repertorial skills were zero. He has to be regarded as the finest, the greatest, the Byron of beat poetry. I mean, what he writes were wonderful, long prose poems. And if you closely inspect what goes on in there, you'll find out that actually hardly anything ever happens. He and a buddy get drunk and go to Las Vegas, get drunk and stoned and go to Las Vegas. In Las Vegas, nothing happens. Except the buddy disappears somehow, and Hunter gets drunk and gets stoned and goes back home. That's the entire story, you know. But it's genius. It's absolutely brilliant stuff. And his fear and loathing on the campaign trail, as reporting, is of no interest. And now looking back on it, I just was going through it the other day to see if it had any historical relevance, and also pondering how Hunter would have treated Trump. And it doesn't. It's all from inside Hunter's head. And it's marvelous stuff. And it doesn't age, actually, even though all the people he's talking about are long forgotten. The work itself endures in a bizarre, you know, in that the way that true art does. But yes, Saturday Night Live is probably the biggest culprit here. You know, when you can't take anything seriously, it can cause some serious problems. And I say that as somebody who's unserious for a living.
Can I'm going to just bring in Mark Dempsey, because he takes you a little further down that track, just in terms of fake news and misleading information. Mark.
Sorry, you caught me by surprise there.
Oh, yes.
Remind me what I said there again.
You said something about whether or not you just made a point when PJ was saying that 20% of people think that COVID has landed from Mars. So I'm misquoting.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
You know, shouldn't you be alarmed by that scale of kind of misinformation in the public bloodstream?
Yeah, absolutely. PJ, firstly, wonderful to hear you and to see you. I've read your books a long time ago. But yes, just the prevalence of misinformation is so incredibly worrying that so many people are willing to believe anything. And it reminds me of a Facebook post, and I'm off Facebook. I just saw it posted on Twitter, which I follow more as for an information source. But the tweet was about, I think it was 150,000 people shared it, which meant it had a much wider reach. And it basically said that Biden's campaign manager had just been arrested. And when this kind of information, and that's by no means the worst of it, is flowing so freely and multiplying so quickly before any content moderator can get near it, that has to have huge consequences.
Oh, it does. It's horrible. But let us not forget that it was always so. and that improvements, technical improvements in human communication don't seem to make it any better. You know, if we go back to tribal times, you know, when we were all living, you know, in our little hunter-gatherer group, wandering about killing mastodon or whatever we were doing. You can imagine that there was very hard to get serious information, and it remains very hard to get serious, true information today. But you know, we do manage somehow or other to survive. In the information technology thing, one interesting thing to me was movable type. I mean, what is like one of the greatest inventions of ever in terms of human communication was movable type. But what did Gutenberg's invention of, well, he didn't, the Chinese actually invented it, but anyway, Gutenberg's application of movable type to European languages, what was its first and primary effect? Well, the first thing that got printed was the Bible. People started reading the Bible and realizing that maybe the Bible and the Catholic Church didn't sort of match up, and maybe different people had different interpretations of the Bible, and maybe some of the people, when upon careful reading of the Bible, thought there were a few pullings of the long bow and a few stretches in there, Red Sea parting and all. And the result was the 30 Years' War. So, you know, bad information and a difficulty in finding good information is fundamental to human existence. We seem to be living through an exaggerated episode of it, and doubtless, you know, the invention of the internet is, you know, causing our own little 30 Years' War right here. But this problem is absolutely persistent from the beginning of time, and probably will always be with us. It is part of the human condition.
I just wanted to point out to you, Peter, because you were talking, you're missing one of the other things that's happened in the world of digital meetings is that people can weigh in with not just great observations or shared documents, but also more puns. You get more puns in conversations than you used to. And I noticed that as Liz Mosley, my colleague, was flagging up the joy of Four Seasons Total Landscaping, David Wood referenced a t-shirt I hadn't seen, which was "Make America Rake Again," which is absolutely brilliant thing, and is important in a host of different ways. Peter, can I take you to a couple of things which are sort of big picture, the future of the US? I know it's sort of unfair to ask you to do a bit of crystal ball, but you have an argument in the book about the difference between nationalism and patriotism, right? And part of the idea around Make America Great Again was not just about the quality of life inside the United States, but the return to its superpower status. I'm struck, you know, if you know your writing, you've traveled a lot on a lot of the US's international expeditions, let's say.
Yes.
Do you think that, regardless of who the president is, that period of US leadership or power in the world is over? And if so, what comes next?
No, I don't think it's over. I might wish it were in many cases. But I don't think it's over, and it isn't over because if you're in trouble, are you going to call China? Are you going to call Russia? Are you going to call the EU? No, you dial 01, you know. And perhaps America isn't the superpower that it once was, which was kind of an accident of all the damage that was left after World War II. Left us the one biggest nations standing and relatively undamaged. We won't go back to that disproportion, but you know, until the until some other thing about America is that we do at least sort of try to fix problems. We often do it very badly. War in Iraq is being a good example of bad effort. But you really cannot, when you have some sort of horrible internal problem, you can't call on the UN, you can't call on the EU, you certainly can't call on Russia, and you probably shouldn't call on China to help you out with this problem. So America, I think, is left with this role of world's policeman or world's referee or world's aid agency, or however one wants to put it.
And so,
I think we're stuck with that for a while.
I see that one person was asking, actually, will you just spell out that difference in your mind between nationalism and patriotism?
Oh, nationalism and patriotism, yeah. Actually, I owe that distinction to two people. George Orwell was very eloquent on the subject, wrote a whole essay on patriotism versus nationalism. And then Michael Oakeshott, a political philosopher, is also very good on the same. Patriotism is simple love of home. We all have love of home. I grew up in Ohio, and I don't know how many people listening have been to Ohio or know where Ohio is. My children aren't quite sure where Ohio is. It's one of the I states, Iowa, Ohio, Idaho. I don't know. It's all runs together in their head. But, I am a loyal Ohioan, and with all that comes to rooting for Ohio State University, and love regarding Lake Erie as this sort of, the most beautiful body of water in the entire world, muddy and polluted though it may be. Very loyal to my city of Toledo. But I don't want Ohio to invade Michigan. I don't want Ohio to invade Kentucky. I don't want Ohio to overtake the world. I just love my home. Everybody loves their home. It doesn't mean that home is somehow, we may consider it privately superior to the rest of the world, but it doesn't mean that it has some sort of moral supremacy or that it should dominate the entire world. And that is the key difference between nationalism. And that nationalism is a sort of insane belief that that one's place of origin should dominate the universe, whereas patriotism is more nostalgia. It's a kindlier emotion, a more forgiving emotion.
And do you think, can I, as we come towards the end here, we've got just 5 minutes or so left, PJ, I wanted to ask you, and forgive me, I know that there's a lot of fun to be had in the discussion about this state of the United States, but there are also some of these big questions, and you describe yourself often as a libertarian, and yet I want to take you back to the phrase you used in that acknowledgement about not understanding late stage capitalism, being in the happy position that your publisher doesn't understand it either. But do you look now at the late stage capitalism or the capitalism that we find now, and it gives you pause to reconsider that libertarianism?
I don't know if it gives me cause to reconsider libertarianism, but it gives me the willies to see the stock market, to take an example, so completely disconnected from the economic life. I mean, we're having a serious economic struggle. Lots of people are short on the rent, about to default on the mortgage, short on food even. I mean, a lot of people are in desperate circumstances. This whole pandemic thing has made, has made the more prosperous among us uncomfortable, but it's made life miserable and indeed dangerous for the poor people. World poverty has increased for the first time in this century, has increased in the past year, largely due to restrictions of trade due to the pandemic. And to see the world of finance, just the other day I was listening on the radio and said GE was going to lay off 13,000 employees because nobody's buying jet engines, because nobody's flying in airplanes. And GE's stock went up by $5. And I'm going, wait a minute, this is not how it would work if I were a partner in the local corner store whose business was down by 50%. They wouldn't be paying me my share of the profits would not go up. Yeah, I don't understand it. But I think one of the reasons I don't understand, and I don't think anybody really understands it, is that when you have a technological revolution, such as the Industrial Revolution, such as the invention of the moldboard plow, for that matter, when you have a technological revolution, and we're having one, we're in the midst of this electronic technological, it knocks all sorts of customary and long established economic assumptions out of whack. And nobody knows where. I mean, Adam Smith, the greatest thinker about economics ever, absolutely brilliant book, The Wealth of Nations, he knew James Watt, who invented the modern steam engine. He actually had invested in a couple of James Watt's projects, and Adam Smith did not see the Industrial Revolution coming. He just didn't see it happening. He did not predict in any of the things, you know, of the good things or the dark satanic mills or any of that. It was all lost on Adam Smith, who knew James Watt, who was right there in Edinburgh and Glasgow at the time that the Industrial Revolution was being invented. So I don't feel too bad about my ignorance. If somebody as smart as Adam Smith could be ignorant.
Can I just say, PJ, I just want to tip my hat to Andrew Girdwood, who's commented in the chat, shame that no one could understand what Adam and James were saying. I thought it's a very, very nice point. PJ, one final thought on the other side of the equation, if you like, which is, you know, there's an amazing thing being a pointed political satirist. There's a suspicion these days that in one way it's much harder to do on the left than on the right, that actually there's a whatever you call it, there's a cancel culture, there is a hostility to satire or unpopular, socially unacceptable free speech. And I wondered whether or not when you sit at the keyboard, whether you sometimes think, actually there are these things I just can't say these days, this stuff I can't say.
Apparently, I don't know. I don't feel constrained in that way, but I don't have too much sympathy for the humorists of the left because they've had an absolute field day for 5 or 6 years with Trump and all that Trump stands for and Trump supporters. One prejudice, incidentally, that you're allowed to have in the United States, all other prejudices being forbidden, but you're still allowed to pick on high school educated white males. You can say anything you want about a high school educated white male without fear of causing anybody to cancel your platform. And sort of the core supporters of Trump have taken a real beating in the comedic world for 4 or 5 years now. So yeah, I'm not. So when I see leftists get on each other about, not being sufficiently inclusive or culturally appropriating something or not taking Me Too seriously enough, I just look at them and I think, well, they eat their own. They're sort of like guppies, aren't they? They eat their own children.
And it's not, but it doesn't impact you. It doesn't curtail you.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I would like to think that that's because I don't have a bunch of really offensive opinions, but I suppose to somebody I must,
Yeah, well, that's something. Listen, I wanted to, as we come in here, I wanted to say thank you. There are so many things. I hope everyone will pick up the book. Actually, I should also pick up Republican Party Reptile and read that again too, because it's amazing. There are so many things here which are just beautiful turns of phrase, PJ. They're also sometimes just these ideas where now it's in your head, you won't ever see that thing in the same way again. And there's a whole chapter in this book about how one of the real problems of inequality is that it used to be the case that rich people had to wear very uncomfortable clothes, starch collars and ties and ridiculous top hats. So even if they were very rich, they looked very uncomfortable. But these days, I think you say, I won't name Mark Zuckerberg by name. And then
Billionaires in their underwear.
I think you say, now you start off having a go at Mark Zuckerberg for showing up in a t-shirt, and then now we have Jeff Bezos in a New Kids on the Block bomber jacket, Bill Gates outfitted in Mr. Rogers sweaters, and Gloria Steinem's old aviators and cutting his own hair, Elon Musk smoking pot on TV, and Richard Branson looking like the guy at the end of the bar muttering lines from The Big Lebowski. But all in all, being rich is looking much too comfortable.
It is, and I think that's just one of the reasons that I assume it's popular. The Crown is very popular over there. I would think so. It's hugely popular in the United States, and it's wonderful to get to see all these rich people in such unenviable positions. I mean, who the hell would want to be any one of them? I mean, talk about buttoned up, starched up,
Yeah, they look incredibly uncomfortable. It makes it
right,
easy.
and they are. They are incredibly uncomfortable. And yes,
it's been, as you could tell, a pleasure for me. I think a pleasure for everyone. It's a real shame. The only thing that's bad about this digital thing is that you can't applaud and laugh.
No, it looks silly on Zoom. Yeah,
it looks silly. But the other thing is, what you don't have is at the end of it when 30 people crowd around you and you think to yourself, I'm never going to be able to get out of this room. The advantage is,
actually what I'm thinking is I need a drink.
Yeah, exactly.
So if the 30 people crowding around me are bringing me a drink, I'm fine.
PJ, thank you very much for your way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
See you later.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.